All right, so I invite Professor Richard Rogers to share his screen. And meanwhile, I'll introduce him. Okay, so Professor Richard Rogers holds the chair in New Media and Digital Culture at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Rogers is the director of the govcom.org Foundation and the Digital Methods Initiative, where he and his colleagues develop tools to capture and study the web. Professor Rogers is the author of several books and many papers, with recently published the book Doing Digital Methods and another book that was just out together with a colleague, The Politics of Social Media Manipulation, published by Amsterdam University Press. There's so much more to share, to say, and his work is a true inspiration for scholars from a broad range of domains. And today we'll hear Professor Richard Rogers' talk titled Mainstreaming the Fringe, How Misinformation Propagates on Social Media. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction and the invitation to give a paper. What I'm going to do is talk about a study that we performed with a team of researchers with First Draft News, the Open Intelligence Lab, as well as the Digital Methods Initiative, on the so-called misinformation problem, and specifically the misinformation problem in the run-up to the 2020 US elections. And I want to talk about a number of different platforms and Google Web Search, and dig into the extent of the misinformation problem per platform. And in particular, I want to talk about the relationship between misinformation and mainstream media on social media, and also Google Web Search. And this is the sort of deceptively simple question: to what extent does misinformation resonate online in political spaces, in social media, in the run-up to the 2020 presidential elections? And so this is quite a large-scale study, cross-platform, and the study that the sort of subparts I'm going to show you today have also been extended to now after the storming of the U.S. Capitol building, but I won't get into that. So I'll show you the findings that we made up to the 2020 elections, and we're interested largely in the relationship between mainstream authority, if you will, and authority online. So in some sense, it also is some social epistemology, but I won't be using the language of that. I also want to talk about the politicization of misinformation, and the politicization of misinformation also per platform, and the question of its depoliticization. And so I'm going to talk about Facebook, Google Web Search, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and 4chan. So I just want to give you the findings in brief off the top. And what's interesting is that the amount of engagement with mainstream media on social media is in decline, is in rather massive decline. And so generally speaking, we have a number of relationships between the platform's users and mainstream media. So on TikTok, the mainstream media is parodied. On 4chan and Reddit, it's dismissed, and instead you're pointed to what's been referred to as alternative influencer networks, especially on YouTube. On Facebook, there's a decline in the amount of mainstream media referenced. Instagram, influencers, as you can imagine, dominate user engagement. Google Web Search is one of the few places where the mainstream media is still buoyed, but they're not outperforming, so to speak, special interest sites. So this is the state of play, and the way we found this is by using quite simple data journalism techniques, where we measure the engagement of stories and how far from the top they are, and we then used existing classification sources in order to classify sites and stories as being either mainstream or problematic, as well as the politics. So just briefly, we queried these platforms. We made political queries that we queried them with the names of the politicians, with the names of political parties, and with the name and also social issues. And so we're demarcating political spaces. So in some sense, what we're studying is political Facebook, political Google web search, etc. And the outputs of these queries are demarcated sets, so to speak, so result sets, and then they're ranked by engagement, and engagement differs per platform. Okay, so I'm going to go through really briefly each of these sub-studies and just so you get a sense of the state of play per platform in terms of the misinformation problem. So Facebook in some sense is the birthplace of the so-called fake news crisis. This is the famous graphic that was in the BuzzFeed News article in 2016, November 2016, that was written by Craig Silverman, where he famously found that so-called, and then he used the term, fake news was outperforming mainstream news in the run-up to the 2016 US presidential elections, right in the quarter just before the elections. Now, what's interesting about this is his definition of fake news. He includes imposter sites, conspiracy sites, as well as what he called hyper-partisan sources. And these are web operations with a clear ideological stance. And so this was the birth of it. Now, when we redid this in the run-up to the 2020 elections, what we found was that mainstream news is outperforming quote unquote fake news, but the outperformance is sort of has worsened compared to 2016. So this is in the first one of the first quarters of the 3 quarters that that Silverman was studying. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about the definitions or the ontologies or the classification of fake news. So this is basically Silverman's classification, and in some sense, it's a broad definition. So it includes, as I said, the hyper-partisan as well. Now, if we move the bar, so to speak, up there, and this is how largely Facebook and also others, not just Facebook, define what they call not fake news but false news. You see that the definition is sort of narrower or stricter, or the classification narrower or stricter. And then if you apply that, the problem gets a lot smaller, as you could well imagine. So with the original definition, you have a worsening problem, but with the narrower definition, you have an improvement. And so in some sense, you see that the classification matters. In terms of the politics, if you were to include hyper-partisan sources as part of this so-called fake news or misinformation problem, then these are by far on the right side of the political spectrum. And so fake news or misinformation on social media becomes a sort of a conservative or hyper-partisan conservative problem. So the politics of demarcation, I think, is important, or the politics of classification, and it's interesting that if you were to take Facebook's definition, obviously they would be in some sense less culpable in mainstreaming the fringe. Google's interesting because it's relatively understudied where misinformation is concerned, though they have been making quite a few efforts in what you could call editorial epistemologies like Facebook and Instagram and others. That is kind of hard editing the results for what you might call serious queries. So serious queries being election-related queries as well as COVID-related queries where you have results edited in And so here we looked at political Google web search, so to speak. And what we found is for the elections related queries, there's not that much problematic information towards the top. Um, but again, when we looked at the sort of politics of the sources, you see the point that's been made about quote unquote big tech as having a liberal bias. The top return sources for all of the queries, largely all the political queries, returned far more quote unquote liberal sources than conservative ones. But what's perhaps even more surprising is that what in this study were called special interest websites. So these are non-governmental, but also other ones that are non-official sources, so to speak, they outperformed the mainstream media as well. So whilst this has the least problem in terms of the mainstream authority, it still has an issue, so to speak. So what's interesting here is this one's empirically found that there is this quote unquote liberal media bias. It's not just a political imaginary. The thing is that search engines have never been in the business of any journalistic epistemologies. They don't provide quote unquote balanced results anyhow. And okay, I'll move on. Twitter. We looked at the extent to which problematic information was in the most engaged with or retweeted tweets. These would be then the URLs that appear in the most retweeted political tweets. We also looked at the extent to which there are quote unquote problematic users amongst the most active users in these spaces. And we looked at the political leanings of both the sources as well as the users. So what we generally found was that the mainstream outperformed the sort of problematic, but there's a very large quantity of sources that were subclassified as hyperpartisan. So the hyperpartisan sources are doing extremely well in political Twitter. Secondly, we found that there are quite a few problematic users. There are even a few on the left side of the political spectrum, but they're by far on the right side of the political spectrum. And so in this case, if you were to think of political Twitter as being of great relevance in the run up to the elections, as I think most do, especially the way Trump was using it. What we have found is that whilst the mainstream did outperform problematic sources, there's a large abundance of hyperpartisan sources. There's amongst the top users, there's a lot of artificial amplification, and that's most notably from the conservative side. And so if one were to remove the artificially amplified, or want to remove or otherwise tag or label or the hyperpartisan sources, what you would be doing would be labeling or removing the conservative voice. On Instagram, what we looked at was, this is also, I think, of interest given the previous papers. In media studies, there's an important work that's come out recently, which says that we have in some ways underappreciated the fact that people are not acting necessarily earnestly online. Rather, there's not only a lot of trolling and bullying, etc., but there's a lot of what Phillips and Milner have called ambivalent action, where when you post, you don't really know what the intention or what the meaning is. They could go either way, and so we were looking into the amount of earnest as well as ambivalent posts, in particular on Instagram, as well as the amount of divisive content. And this is the first one. The second one was again looking into artificial amplification, and the third one, well, once we found that the most engaged with content was by influencers and different kinds of celebrities, we were interested in and what their contribution is to the information climate. So what's interesting about Instagram, and this is in some ways counterintuitive, was that most of the posts were in fact earnest, as well as not divisive. In some sense, Instagram is a fairly clean space. And when posts are divisive in red, they're also earnest. So there was very little of this ambivalence or this kind of troll-like behavior there. We also found that the artificial amplification, I mean, it is greater on the right side of the political spectrum, but it's in some sense within the range of what is considered to be normal. Another view of it here, where Trump has the most problematic set of users from an artificial amplification point of view, or a sort of fake follower point of view. Well, what we found when looking into the celebrities or into the influencers is that they were largely first of all, they're outperforming the mainstream media by far, and so the mainstream authority also on Instagram has waned, or perhaps was never authoritative in the first place. I mean, we've done previous studies on it, and I'm talking in some sort of chronological comparative sense, but when I actually shouldn't be, but when we're looking at if I think about the previous studies we've done, the mainstream authority is in fact in decline. But in any case, the influencers here, interestingly enough, were rather responsible. I mean, for example, they were debunking the sort of coronavirus 5G conspiracy theory. So these are the two findings. I mean, as well as the lack of mainstream authority there. On TikTok, I mean, it's interesting. One might not think at first glance that TikTok is a political space. However, they think it was about 6 months before the election, they added to their community guideline policy, and they added sort of warnings to saying that they added a political content policy, basically, this gave us a sort of an indication of the fact that it could be considered as a political space. What's interesting is that generally speaking on TikTok, when you think about misinformation, and this is a quite well-known sort of misinformation classification scheme by Claire Wardle of First Draft in the Shorenstein Center at Harvard. When you think about TikTok, you think about it as sort of possibly, if there's misinformation, it would be like the least harmful, so to speak. It would fall into the category of parody. This is what you see mainly on TikTok. And so what we did is we looked into that empirically, querying particular political hashtags and looking at at those videos that were in some sense the most popular. And asked ourselves the question of the extent to which there's a misinformation problem there. So it's interesting how most of these videos, we're talking about like the top 40 per 4 queries, are mostly sarcastic. They use different kinds of sort of sounds or other forms of creative expression to instill what we found, instill mistrust in what you're seeing. So if mainstream media is being shown, there'll be like someone redoing a kind of emoji, an emoji that indicates mistrust, or they'll play a particular sound effect that includes it. And so what we found was in some sense a kind of new category or a new type of sort of hybrid information type. So we have mistrustful satire mixed with other types of misinformation. So there the mainstream media is in some sense sort of mistrusted or and parodied at the same time. Yeah, on 4chan and Reddit. So 4chan and Reddit are very different kinds of social media. So they're whereas the ones that I was just discussing, you could call public-facing social media. This is masked social media. So these are anonymous users. And what we looked into is there are a couple of ways of demarcating political spaces on 4chan. So we used the board 4chan Poll, the politically incorrect board, which is the largest board now. It's larger than the B board, which is famous for the group Anonymous, the hackers. And on Reddit, we used a number of political Reddits, not just the Donald, of course, which has not so long ago been deplatformed. And what we were looking at is first about the relationship between mainstream authority and problematic information, but also a few other types of content. One was pink slime sites. And so this is a particular form. These are imposter sites. There's a particular form of misinformation. And we also were looking at the question of the extent to which the so-called alternative influence network is relevant there. These are the top 50 sort of YouTubers on the so-called reactionary right as being a sort of alternative news authority to the mainstream. So what we found is that there is quite a lot of mainstream media reference, but that's referenced it's sort of dismissively. By far the most referenced content are actually or by far the majority are YouTube videos. And when you look into the YouTube videos, you get into a particular kind of genre. A lot of them are these vloggers or these YouTubers that provide alternative cultural and political commentary. If you dig into it deeply, you see that on 4chan, there's a particular subset. They're more hardline. That are referenced a lot, and on Reddit, it's a little bit softer, or it can be sometimes a little bit more intellectual, so to speak. But nevertheless, the alternative influence network is quite significant as an alternative to the mainstream. What we also found was that these pink slime websites, they didn't do well at all. So these kind of imposter sites suggesting, at least to the authors of this, a particular form of literacy amongst of channers and people on Reddit. But the most significant finding is the lack of authority, lack of mainstream authority, which was largely sort of dismissed, and the rise of alternative influencers as the new news. So all in all, this is what we asked, as I said, and the findings as I just put them to you. Now, I think there are a number of challenges with respect to the decline in what I've called mainstream authority. And they're different per platform. So all of these platforms have a kind of a different relationship to the mainstream. But what we are now seeing, of course, is the rise of content moderation and what I called editorial epistemologies, and these. Of course, are combined with some automation, but most of the automation is based on what has been found to be problematic previously. And so if there's a new type of content that's then been flagged in a crowdsourced way or what have you, then it passes human moderation. And the question is in some sense has to do with the future of authority online, and the future of the politics of authority online. And the question, I think, the main question is how to currently depoliticize all of these different forms of content moderation: labeling, flagging, demonetizing, deranking, removal, deplatforming, etc. I think that that's the greatest challenge ahead. This set of studies will be in a volume published by Amsterdam University Press, I think 2021, called Mainstreaming the Fringe: How Misinformation Propagates in Social Media. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Richard. We'll take the questions now. Okay, so Axel, please. Oh, you raised it.
Actually, that was just clapping. That was just clapping.
Okay, sorry. So
maybe I'll come up with one in the next few minutes, but I'd like to give someone else the chance first.
My mistake, sorry. Okay, so
I mean, since it's the last talk, we don't necessarily have to have questions.
There can be discussion as well, that is true. So please join us, it's okay.
I think Boaz has one.
Hi. Yeah, can you hear me? Speaker view, okay. So I'm wondering about the conflict between like two epistemologies that you discussed. One is editorial epistemology, where trained people make judgment and sort of like make sure that you get the right results, search results on Google, right? Especially on sensitive topics. And the other one is what you called in your previous book, a collision space of different worldviews, and let sort of like the web decide on its own. And each of them has different, like from a normative perspective, each of them has different advantages and disadvantages, or pros and cons. And I'm wondering, from a normative perspective, how would you like to see Google treatment of search of sensitive topics? So you seem to imply that you don't like so much editorial manipulation of results, but on the other hand, just letting the web decide on its own, sort of like through its own organic structure. It's a bit of a romantic ideal, because there is no such thing as like it's the organic web just decide, and it has its own problems. So as I'm wondering, from a more normative perspective, how would you like Google to handle searches of sensitive topics?
Yeah, so in this the kind of paper that accompanies this this talk, I talk about the rise of what I called serious queries, and these are currently election-related queries as well as pandemic-related ones. And they're actually, when you study it empirically, you'll notice that the pandemic-related ones that these both social media as well as Google Web Search are taking seriously are really narrow. It's COVID and Corona. And if you start searching for a vaccine, you'll get into misinformation or get into conspiracy spaces quite quickly. So the editorial epistemologies that they're undertaking at the moment are very narrow. So the question is, can they be expanded? Now, so this is not, so I would be in favor of an expansion of that. But when you look at it in practice, for example, fact checking. So Facebook is in partnership with AFP in France and DPA, Deutsche Presseagentur in Germany, and in the run up to the 2020 elections, and then thereafter, also around the storming of the U.S. Capitol, they're fact checking 2 posts a day. And so the question of the amount that can be done now, the commercial content moderation, this is what a lot of the misleading information stories or posts are being looked at through commercial content moderation. These are folks who have been trained for, let's say, a week on to remove pornography, violence, etc., and have not had any journalistic training whatsoever to begin to make some sort of distinction between something that's misleading or whatever. So then the next kind of editorial epistemology is indeed this romantic one, and that's crowdsourcing, and it's thought to be kind of web native. The blogosphere is quite famous as in some sense, and in some sense an epistemic community, sort of passing judgment on the news on the one hand as well, but the blogosphere is of course in decline. But this is where this sort of wisdom of the crowd idea came from, together with Wikipedia. And this is very, this is sort of mid to like 2005, 2006, 2000. I mean, crowdsourcing as an epistemology has continued, but not necessarily one that has been put into use quite seriously. I mean, you can flag things as a user. Anyway, so this is now the one that's thought to be interesting by Twitter. They started this Bird Watchers, right? So this is this program in the US that you can become one of these, and then because they're all these social media companies don't want to be the arbiters. They don't want to be the ones making the decision. So they need to outsource it. So who are they going to outsource it to? And so the users become then the most likely. So I'm not against it, but all of them have their issues.
Okay, so if no one has a question, I would like to ask something. Okay, so my question is more general. So obviously the platforms change across time and develop, and misinformation is propagated differently throughout time. So what I would like to ask you, and in this sense it's a more general question than this presentation, is whether empirical results will differ or will change according to the issue, or on different locations, or on different time.
Oh yeah, sure. And I mean, well, first of all, like just a couple of issues about sort of doing this kind of work. Like going back in time is quite tricky. So you have to do this kind of work oftentimes in real time. If you go back in time, what you realize quickly is that the social media companies, they control their own archives, and they regularly update them. So this is one issue. Secondly, what is considered extreme content in Germany is different from the Netherlands. So if you want to study, content removal in Germany, strangely enough, you should probably do that in the Netherlands, because then you can see what's been the different kinds of tags that have been put on the tweets that you can no longer see in Germany. These sorts of so there are differences, chronologically as well as geographically, but I think there are many more things that are far more difficult than those two things, and that is just simply the classifications and the determinations, and who decides, and who's the judge. So the whole adjudication, and what we do in our work normally is for the sort of political leaning tag, and as well as the sort of misinformation or not tag, as we sort of outsource those to sources that do that, meta sources that do that. So there are organizations, journalistic organizations, and other organizations that are constantly labeling content, and then digging into those labels. I mean, you can triangulate them and say, okay, this is pretty, like three or four of them say it's misinformation, so okay, and 3 or 4 of them say it's. But there are differences, and there's the whole question of whether this stuff should be classified at all. So that as misinformation. So there are problems, much greater problems with the classifications than they are with the geographical and chronological.
Okay, thank you. It was eye-opening. So this is a good time to thank the speakers of the session and to all of the speakers in the previous sessions for a wonderful day. And of course, on behalf of all the organizers, I want to thank everyone here who participated here. And I invite you all for tomorrow, where we are expecting another exciting day. So thank you, everyone.